What's behind the Ukraine crisis? After the Soviet Union collapsed, NATO expanded eastward, eventually taking in most of the European nations that had been in the communist sphere. The Baltic republics of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, once parts of the Soviet Union, joined NATO, as did Poland, Romania, and others. As a result, NATO moved hundreds of miles closer to Moscow, directly bordering Russia. And in 2008, it stated that it planned someday to enroll Ukraine, though that is still seen as a far off prospect. Mr. Putin has described the Soviet disintegration as a catastrophe that robbed Russia of its rightful place among the world's great powers and put it at the mercy of predatory West. He has spent his 22 years in power rebuilding Russia's military and reasserting its geopolitical clout. The Russian president calls NATO's expansion menacing and the prospect of Ukraine joining it a major threat to his country. Mr. Putin has also insisted that Ukraine and Belarus are fundamentally parts of Russia, culturally and historically. But East-West relations worsened drastically in early 2014 when mass protests in Ukraine forced out a president closely allied with Mr. Putin. Russia swiftly invaded and annexed Crimea, part of Ukraine. Moscow also fomented a separatist rebellion that took control of part of the Donbas region of Ukraine in a war that still grinds on, having killed more than 13,000 people. What does Putin want? Mr. Putin appears intent on winding back the clock to more than 30 years, establishing a broad Russian-dominated security zone resembling the power Moscow wielded in Soviet days. Now, 69 years old and possibly edging towards the twilight of his political career, he clearly wants to draw Ukraine, a nation of 44 million people, back into Russia's sphere of influence. Russia presented NATO and the United States in December with a set of written demands that it said were needed to ensure its security. The demands included a ban on Ukraine entering NATO, limit the deployment of troops and weapons to NATO's eastern flank, in effect returning NATO forces to where they were sanctioned in 1997 before an eastward expansion. Moscow said ignoring its interests would lead to a military response similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And the West dismissed the main demands out of hand while making overtures on other concerns and threatening sanctions. How is the United States responding? In early December, President Biden made clear that his administration was not considering sending troops to fight for Ukraine. He gives the reason that Ukraine is not a member of NATO alliance and does not come under its commitment to collective defense. Instead, the United States has sent anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons to Ukraine, increased the American military presence in NATO countries that border Russia, and ordered an additional 7,000 troops to Europe. The Pentagon also ordered the deployment of an armored brigade combat team to Germany to reassure skittish NATO allies in Eastern Europe. Administration officials also warned that the United States could throw its weight behind an Ukrainian insurgency. Before the invasion, Mr. Biden threatened Mr. Putin with economic consequences like he has never seen before. The United States was freezing trillions of dollars in Russian assets, including the funds controlled by Russian elites and their families, making them pay for what the American president called a premeditated attack against the free nation in Europe. The Biden administration could also institute sanctions that could deprive Russians of their beloved next-generation phones, laptops, and other gadgets. What's at stake for Europe? At stake for Europe is a security structure that has helped keep the peace on the continent since World War II. Europeans were initially divided over how to respond to various forms of Russian aggression, and the conflict laid bare the fractures within European Union and NATO. But outrage over Mr. Putin's aggression has helped foster a unified front, and the European Union unveiled penalties that they described as unprecedented for the bloc in terms of scale and reach. Europe has important trade ties with Russia and stands to lose far more than the United States from sanctions. It is also dependent on Russian gas supplies, a weakness that Mr. Putin has exploited past disputes. Europe lost an invaluable negotiator with Moscow after the departure of Chancellor Angela Merkel, who grew up in the past, speaks fluent Russian, and had developed a good working relationship with the Russian president. Her successor, Olaf Scholz, has tried to take on a leadership role in the crisis that escalated soon after his election, halting certification of the Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline that would link his country with Russia. Where does India stand on this? India made its first statement on the crisis, which is articulated by Ministry of External Affairs official spokesperson Arindam Bagchi. We have been closely following the developments related to Ukraine, including the ongoing high-level discussions between Russia and the US. Our embassy in Kyiv is also monitoring local developments. We call for a peaceful resolution of the situation through sustained diplomatic efforts for long-term peace and stability in the region and beyond. With key strategic partners on both sides, India can't afford any hasty moves hurting its vital stakes. New Delhi does not want to jeopardize its close military ties with Moscow.